There is a lost world beneath the North Sea. Not a myth, not a fantasy island, not some made-up Atlantis story. A real landscape. A place where people may have lived, hunted, traveled, built fires, followed rivers, crossed valleys, and watched the sea move closer. Today, we call it Doggerland. But thousands of years ago, it was not underwater. It was land. And it connected Britain to mainland Europe. Which means there was a time when Britain was not really an island. You could walk from what is now Britain into what is now the Netherlands, Germany, or Denmark. No ferry, no tunnel, no border, just land, rivers, wetlands, forests, animals, and people. That alone is strange enough, but the deeper you go into Doggerland, the more uncomfortable the story becomes. Because this was not just an empty land bridge people used to get somewhere else. It may have been a whole world in its own right, a prehistoric heartland, a place full of life. And then, slowly, it disappeared. The simple version sounds neat. After the last ice age, the climate warmed. Ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose. The low-lying land between Britain and Europe began to flood. Eventually, Doggerland vanished beneath the North Sea. That is the clean explanation. But clean explanations hide messy human stories. Because imagine living there while it happened. Not watching it vanish on a map. Actually being there. One generation grows up beside a river. The next sees marshes expand. The next sees familiar paths turn into coastline. The next has to move inland. The next hears grandparents speak of land that no longer exists. And then, one day, the old world is gone. Not destroyed overnight. Not swallowed in one dramatic movie scene. Just taken. Piece by piece, year by year. Until all that remained was memory. And then, eventually, even the memory disappeared. For a long time, Doggerland was treated like a background detail, a land bridge, a crossing point, a convenient explanation for how people and animals moved between Britain and Europe. But what if that is backwards? What if Doggerland was not just the road between important places? What if Doggerland was the important place? Because when researchers look beneath the North Sea, they are not just finding mud and old seabed, they are reconstructing buried landscapes, ancient river systems, valleys, lakes, forests, wetlands, the kind of environment that would have been full of food, movement, and opportunity. Instead of picturing a cold, empty wasteland, we may need to picture something much more alive. A landscape people could use, a landscape people may have depended on, a landscape worth staying in. There were animals, plants, rivers that shaped roots, and places where water, shelter, food, and movement came together. And that changes the feeling of the story. Because when we say Doggerland disappeared, we are not just talking about land. We may be talking about the loss of homes, routes, hunting grounds, gathering places, burial places, sacred sites, memories, entire ways of life. The problem is that most of it is now underwater, and that makes Doggerland feel almost suspiciously silent. If a settlement disappears under soil, archaeologists might find it. If a monument falls, stones can remain. If a village burns, ash can survive. But if a whole landscape sinks under the sea, the evidence becomes harder to reach, harder to protect, harder to understand, and much easier to forget. So how much prehistoric history is sitting under the North Sea right now? How many campsites? How many tools? How many graves? How many places that meant something to people? How many stories did the water erase? That is the unsettling part. Not only that, Doggerland vanished, but that it may have taken part of human history with it. There is also the disaster story. The one people remember. The giant tsunami. Around 8,150 years ago, the Storegga submarine landslide off the coast of Norway sent a tsunami across parts of the North Atlantic. It hit coastlines, it left traces, and for years it has been tempting to imagine this as the moment Doggerland died. One huge wave, one prehistoric catastrophe. Britain cut off from Europe in a single terrifying event. It is dramatic. Cinematic. It feels like the ending a lost world deserves. But the truth may be more disturbing, because the tsunami was not necessarily the single event that wiped Doggerland away. By then, sea levels had already been rising. The land had already been shrinking. People there may already have been adapting, retreating, and losing ground. So maybe Doggerland was not killed by one wave. Maybe it was already dying. And the tsunami was one violent chapter in a much longer collapse. That version is less dramatic, but it is more haunting. Because sudden disasters are easy to understand. A wave comes, a place is destroyed, the story ends. But slow disaster is different. Slow disaster gives people time to deny it, time to adjust, time to say it has always flooded here. Time to move a little further inland. Time to pretend the old world is not really ending, until eventually, the map has changed, and nobody alive remembers when it was different. That is why Doggerland feels so modern. Even though it is ancient, a whole landscape changed by rising seas, a population forced to adapt, a world transformed so completely that future generations could barely imagine it existed. And now we are the ones trying to reconstruct it from fragments. Fishing nets have pulled up bones and tools. Dredged material has brought ancient artifacts onto modern beaches. Scientists use seismic data, sediment cores, and ancient DNA to rebuild a place nobody has seen for thousands of years. It is almost like investigating a crime scene where the crime scene is underwater, the witnesses are dead, and the evidence has been scattered by tides for millennia. And still, the shape of the lost world is starting to appear. Not perfectly. Not completely, but enough to make the old story feel too small. Because Doggerland was not just a bridge, it may have been a center, a place between worlds, a place where people moved, hunted, gathered, remembered, and survived. And if that is true, then Britain's island identity has a strange, hidden chapter. Before Britain was separate, it was connected. Before the North Sea was sea, it was land. Before the coastline looked familiar, the map was completely different. That is hard to process, because geography feels permanent. We look at a map and think it is stable. We treat coastlines like facts. We treat islands like they have always been islands. But the Earth does not care about our borders. It does not care about our countries. It does not care what we call an island. Doggerland was real. Then it was gone. And now it exists mostly as traces beneath the water. But here is the question that makes the story feel almost impossible. If Doggerland was inhabited, if people lived there, if they watched the land disappear, did they remember it? Did stories of a drowned land survive for generations? Did ancient flood myths preserve some distant memory of real events? Or is that just us trying to turn archaeology into legend? We cannot prove that people pass down stories of Doggerland. We cannot point to one myth and say, yes, this is the memory of that exact place. But the idea is hard to ignore, because imagine ancestors telling stories about land beyond the sea. A place where people once walked. A place swallowed by water. A place that became unreachable. After hundreds or thousands of years, what does that story become? History? Myth? Warning? Religion? Maybe nothing survived at all. Maybe the sea took the land, and time took the memory. But maybe some echo remained, not as a map, not as a name, not as Doggerland, but as the feeling that the world had once been different. The official story is already fascinating. A submerged, prehistoric landscape, a drowned connection between Britain and Europe, a place changed by climate, sea level rise, and possibly a massive tsunami. But the bigger question is harder to answer. What exactly did we lose? Not just in land, but in evidence, in culture, in human memory, in everything that may now be buried under one of the busiest seas on Earth. Because if Doggerland had stayed above water, would it be one of Europe's most important archaeological landscapes? Would we have settlements? Burials? Ritual sites? Tools and context? Places that could change how we understand prehistoric Britain? Instead, we mostly have fragments, enough to know it was real, not enough to fully know what it was. And that is what makes Doggerland so powerful. It is not Atlantis. It is stranger than Atlantis. Because Atlantis is a myth people keep trying to prove. Doggerland is real, and most people barely know it existed. A real lost world, a drowned landscape. A missing chapter in European prehistory. And maybe one of the clearest reminders that the past is not always buried beneath our feet. Sometimes it is buried beneath the sea. So, what was Doggerland really? A simple land bridge? A prehistoric heartland? A drowned world that shaped Britain before Britain was an island? Or one of the biggest missing pieces in European history?